everyone. Good afternoon. Good morning. Thanks so much for joining us here today. If we can have some silence, please. Hello. Sorry, but the noise is coming from outside, so we're going to have to keep quiet here as much as possible. Thanks so much for joining us here today. The Secretary General is going to make some initial remarks, and afterwards we're going to have questions for time for a few questions. Secretary General, it's all yours.
Ladies and gentlemen of the media, I thank President Petro for hosting the United Nations Biodiversity Conference in Cali. And I congratulate Colombia on the excellent organization of this COP. And I also thank the people of Colombia for their warm welcome. We all felt very much at home. The world has come to Cali to make peace with nature. And let me be clear, we are facing an existential crisis. Temperatures are climbing higher and higher. We are losing more and more species forever. We are poisoning our waters and treating nature as a disposable asset. Human activities have already altered 3/4 of Earth's land surface and 2/3 of its waters. And no country, rich or poor, is immune to this devastation. So to survive, humanity must make peace with nature. We must transform our economic models, shifting our production and consumption to nature-positive practices. Renewable energy, sustainable supply chains, and zero-waste policies are not optional. They must become the default option for most governments and businesses. Dear friends, the good news is that we have a plan. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework adopted 2 years ago. But nature cannot wait for its implementation any longer. And this is what this COP is about, turning promises into action. We are seeing good progress, and I want to thank everyone for their efforts. But with less than 2 days of negotiations left to go, we need to accelerate. And I want to highlight 3 priorities. First, Cali must spark a new era for ambitious national biodiversity plans. As of today, a majority of countries have national targets that align with the Global Biodiversity Framework. And I urge every member state to follow suit and align these national plans with their adaptation plans and updated climate nationally determined contributions due early next year. We must also reach an agreement on a strengthened monitoring and transparency framework to ensure accountability and move forward together. Second, we must leave Cali with concrete plans to unlock new funding and share the benefits from the use of generic resources. This means capitalizing the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, and I thank the countries and regions that pledged an additional $163 million this week. But if we are to deliver the Global Biodiversity Framework in full, we need much more. We must make sure we are able to mobilize $200 billion annually by 2030 from all sources, domestic, international, public, and private. And developed countries must lead the way and provide at least $20 billion per year by next year to support developing countries, in particular the least developed countries and small island states, in their conservation and restoration efforts. Businesses profiting from nature must also contribute to its protection and restoration. And this includes operationalizing a mechanism for sharing the benefits from the use of the digital sequence information on genetic resources in a clear, fair, and efficient way. Third, we must recognize, involve, and protect those who guard our national heritage. Indigenous peoples and local communities possess vital knowledge of biodiversity conservation. And in this region, people of African descent are key custodians of natural resources. They must all be at the center of our decisions, not only on the sidelines. In Cali, we must agree on the proposal to establish a new permanent body for indigenous peoples and local communities within the Convention on Biological Diversity, ensuring their voices are heard at every step across the work of the Convention. The clock is ticking. The survival of our planet's biodiversity and our own survival are on the line. We don't have a moment to lose. Señoras y señores de la prensa,
Ladies and gentlemen of the press, while the world is gathered in this beautiful country to establish commitments to peace with nature, I want to take advantage of this opportunity to reaffirm our commitment with peace in Colombia. I'm pleased to be in Colombia again in this timely moment to close the painful chapters of war and consolidate this example of peace to the country and the world. I greet the renovated efforts of President Petro and his government to accelerate the implementation of the final peace treaty, even including the rapid action plan to be focused on specific aspects to improve the quality of life in the prioritized territories. In the same way, I acknowledge the firm commitment of the counterpart that undersigned those who were combatants of FARC-EP guerrilla. These former adversaries work together now as partners to build peace. Getting with progresses and challenges to an 8th anniversary, this historical agreement must be kept in the center of the efforts of consolidation of peace. The agreement continues to be the main roadmap to break down the cycles of violence in Colombia, and also to tackle the structural causes of this violence by means of the commitment to raise the integral presence of the state and comprehensive presence in the historically forgotten regions, a presence that undertakes and takes opportunities of development, safety, and inclusive governance. There should be no longer delay for the dividends of peace to reach to all the territories, to all those peoples who are still awaiting for the promise of peace to become real. To ensure justice for the victims is also a must. I acknowledge the valuable effort of the transitional justice process promoted by the government, and I foster its progress. The total peace promoted by the national government is a high and noble goal. Despite the challenges, those efforts seek to grow peace in the country in a supplementary way to the peace agreement. And besides this, please do not lose the path of dialogue. These dialogues are opportunities to end with violence that still hurdles the populations of regions that are also key for the implementation of the peace agreement, especially for the indigenous communities and of African descent in Colombia, the persons displaced and confined by the armed groups, the women who are victims of sexual violence, and the children who are recruited in war. Today, I want to make a call to the Colombian people to be perseverant, to work together. So this is a national shared effort. I want to recall and remind you that Colombia will never be alone on their efforts for peace. It would be an honor to continue accompanying Colombia on its way to peace by means of the verification mission of the UN and the agencies and programs of the team's country. Please count on my support and solidarity with Colombia, as well as with my deep gratitude for the trust and confidence that you have deposited on the United Nations. We will always be next to Colombia.
Open the floor for a few questions. We have TV Caracol from Colombia, please. Someone is giving you the mic here. Yes, that's.
Gracias, secretario.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. From this Caracol.
Assistance here just so we can have the headphones.
I can speak in English if you prefer.
No, no, español es
Español está bien.
Secretario,
de traducción, es
quiero trasladarle una pregunta.
para comprender.
Quiero trasladar
Mr. Secretary, I want to convey a question of many delegations here. How do you see the presence of COP16 of the Venezuelan Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Hill? He's being questioned by many persons, even you, who have demanded him to publish the acts of the elections, and we even saw you distant from Foreign Minister Affairs Hill, even though biodiversity and protection of nature must encompass most of the possible actors. How do you see this here with regards to COP16 in Cali? Thank you.
Aspectos distintos.
There are two different aspects. The first of all, the opinion that we have regarding how the elections went, the absence of transparency in place, and the fact that there are different governments who still have not acknowledged the government of Venezuela. On the other hand, is the functioning mechanism of the multilateral organizations, specifically of the COP. In the COP, there's an accreditation in which those who participate, since the vision of the country will be it's accredited by the country. This is a practice we cannot change because it's established practice on the laws. But this does not validate or invalidate the opinion that we may have of what happened in Venezuela.
Years left to achieve the clinical objectives framework to halt and reduce biodiversity loss by 2030. And here the focus is mainly on resource mobilization. Is that the correct approach? Is it really the fight over finance that will determine the success of the GBF? Is it the fight over finance that is key to determine the success of GBF, or is it something else?
I think the most important thing we need, and that is the reason my presence in this COP, is to change what has been the permanent neglect of biodiversity, namely when compared with our efforts in relation to climate change. We need, first of all, to accept the concept that we are facing three existential crises: climate change, biodiversity, and pollution, namely plastics, but they are all interlinked and indivisible. And so the central question is to make sure that we are able to put biodiversity as in the center of our concerns in all aspects of policy, of strategy, and of financing, as we are putting climate change. Obviously, finance is essential, but finance is not enough. What you need is a political priority at government level, a political priority at multilateral institutions level, and a clear commitment of the private sector to be involved in order to make sure that we understand that without defeating the biodiversity crisis, we will not defeat the climate crisis, we will not defeat the pollution crisis, and we will condemn our world to a situation of extreme poverty in the natural environment. And this is totally unacceptable. So we must bring the attention of the people, of the government, of institutions and of the private sector to the centrality of biodiversity in the context of our environmental policies.
Very much. Moving right here.
So this is Stella Paul from IPS News, Internet Service News. So our overarching theme here is making peace with nature. But at a time when we are seeing increasing impact of war and conflict on biodiversity across the world, starting from Ukraine to all the way to Palestine, and we are not seeing enough discussion of that in a formal way, even at the COP. How do you think that we can make peace with nature?
Well, we need peace with nature and we need peace among ourselves. That is the reason I've been asking for a just peace in Ukraine, in line with the Charter, in line with international law, and in line with the General Assembly resolutions. That is why we have been asking for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza with the release of all hostages and to massive humanitarian aid to Gaza. That is why we have been asking for peace in Lebanon and a peace that respects Lebanese sovereignty and Lebanese territorial integrity and paves the way for a political solution. That is why we have been asking for peace in Sudan, where an enormous tragedy exists. And obviously, we need to make peace in nature, but we need to make peace among ourselves. Because wars are one of the most devastating impacts of wars have some of the most devastating impacts on biodiversity, on climate, and on pollution.
Thank you so much. At the back there, Lemont, thank you.
Hi. In that parliament, many issues of the negotiations are still unresolved, and many ministers are leaving tonight. And you worry this COP could fail, or at least not be as successful as it should.
I have to say that I met with the 5 groups, and I heard a large number of ministers talking. And I felt that there was a huge will to find a successful result and a huge will of compromise in the pending issues. So I'm quite optimistic that it will be possible to reach a consensus, and not a consensus for the consensus, but a consensus that paves the way for progress after the COP in the implementation of the Montreal Kunming framework.
Thanks so much. We have a question. I have time for one more question now. Please go ahead.
Secretario Silvia Patrino del Blue Hand.
You met President Gustavo Petro yesterday. You were in the meeting with Gustavo Petro yesterday. In the meeting with the Colombian President Gustavo Petro yesterday, and the President talked about the possibility to change the mechanism through which the United Nations measures the amount of coca crops in Colombia.
Despacio.
Más despacio. Perfecto. El presidente Petro
President Petro talked about the possibility that the UN could change the way in which the hectares are measured when we talk about coca in Colombia. The United Nations is willing to do that because precisely talked about a couple of weeks ago around the possibility to buy the coca crops to the farmers to try to really change their crops. Do you think the United Nations, what does the United Nations thinks about this approach? We were dealing against the war against drugs. There are conventions on drugs, and the United Nations is linked to those conventions. But I think it's imperative to open the door to have a very serious reflection in a world where we see that unfortunately the drug trafficking is the same as the arms trafficking as among other types of trafficking, like women, boys and girls. And that this trafficking is mining in many countries the state structure with the corruption that it generates. So I do think that the appeal of Gustavo Petro regarding the mechanisms that we have in place today in relation to the fight against drug trafficking and in regards to the actions taken, I think that the appeal leads to a reflection on the efficacy of the mechanisms that we have in place. And we should really place close attention to this and listen to it. I do not know in detail the project, but the idea is to buy the crops for afterwards using in a positive manner. This can be a very interesting mechanism to avoid this trafficking if it can guarantee that there's a neutralization of that production and that does not increase drug trafficking. But our objective has to be the objective of the preservation of the health of the population and the communities.
We're out of time, but thank you so much for your presence here today. Thank
You
you.
have to catch up to play. Thank you.
So I think this is an important lesson, that when a major power